discussion of these endemic structural problems, and essentially this continued, given that sort of the focus on personality-driven politics, that there are these dominance of informal politics that still dominate Georgian politics. So Georgia's not in a good neighborhood for democratization. There's structural problems. There's still the domination of informal politics. Yet from yesterday and today, the watchword was values, Europe, this is where we're going towards. So if the previous government was maybe a little more enthusiastic about the United States, this government's a little bit more enthusiastic about Europe. These are pull factors towards democratization. But if the Euro-Atlantic integration, if this drags on for years and years, is there sufficient internal elite and public demand, i.e. some sort of national consensus for democratization that will make democratization occur no matter what? Or does democratization in contemporary Georgia depend on achieving these goals? Thank you.
Okay, I think it's an important question. I do think that this, maybe not as solid as before, but still overarching Georgian consensus on European state being a model for Georgia is the most, maybe the single most important factor which explains relative success of Georgia. Sometimes we in democracy studies are so used to ask questions, why is Georgian democracy fail to consolidate? Kind of classical question. But we can ask from other side, why is Georgian autocracy fail to consolidate? Why we are not becoming like Russia or like Putin or like somebody else? And there are structural grounds for that. The governments are usually strong enough. But maybe the most, I cannot say I know answer to that question, but the most obvious thing that comes to mind is that because unlike those other countries, Georgia, the public, the Georgian elite, political elite or opinion-making elite or talking to people or chattering classics, whatever you call them, they have this one thing in common. That success of Georgia means success of European style Georgia. So there is this kind of limitation. There are not sufficient internal limitations on power in Georgia, but this kind of aspiration to be recognized as European kind of state works as some kind of limitation.
I would say that there is a civilizational choice in Georgia consensus that has and continues to favor Euro-Atlantic integration, this European model, and this idea of being part of the European space. My question and my investigation over the past few years is to what extent is that durable in the long term? And I think that's really the heart of your question. And I'm not sure I have a really great answer for it, but what I will say is that when we look at polls, we find that things like NATO or EU integration, the support is quite high, but they're also quite low on the list of priorities. And it's, you know, I don't think you can fault most ordinary Georgians, you know, folks in Glidani or Chiatora or something, for having the sense that, well, you know, the most important thing for me at the end of the day is getting food on the table, paying my bills, getting a job, that kind of thing. And I think that's a kind of a universal consideration that we can all understand. So, to the extent that Euro-Atlantic integration drags on indefinitely, or at least in the far term, at what point does that civilizational choice become in direct conflict with those questions of putting food on the table and getting jobs? And this is something where I am concerned about, because I do think that the Eurasian Economic Union, although I don't believe it to be a very savvy organization or particularly innovative in what it presents or represents, it certainly does provide a certain threshold of development for Georgia. At least there's this perception that the EU can provide a certain level of economic development rapidly and without conditions and without further painful reforms compared to Euro-Atlantic integration, which may or may not happen, and it's kind of dragging along. And the DCFTA is very nice, but you have to get all these export certificates and hopefully get your samichka in such a way that it can be exported to Cyprus or whatever. So it's difficult to look at the DCFTA in Europe as this economic model to follow if you're an ordinary person, when you see that increasing trade with Russia led to a bonanza in agricultural trade overnight, which has declined, and there's certainly a geopolitical factor that you have to be worried about. But if you're thinking about your crop for the next season and selling your grapes or selling your hazelnuts, then you're not really concerned necessarily with perhaps some of the geopolitical factors. And then that sort of leads into some of the other questions. Now, that doesn't mean that I think Georgia is bound for some kind of a Eurasianist takeover, and I do think that the Euro-Atlantic consensus is durable, at least for a significant portion of the population. Maybe not all, maybe not even a majority, but at least a significant enough population that the Eurasianist question isn't going to be one that sees Georgia turn into Armenia over the next few years. But it certainly does move the goalposts, I think. And I think the 2016 or these October elections will really be a test on what that means for coalition building, what that means for Georgia's democratic development, what that means for Georgia's larger geopolitical orientation. So it's a good question that I sort of have just thrown back at you, so you're welcome.
Okay, very quickly, because it's probably been certainly been a long forum, and we've probably reached more than reached the witching hour. I don't know whether Georgia's an Athenian beacon or French lantern or Chinese one. What I just sense in the discussion is that there's a certain feeling that somehow this nation is doomed to go through some kind of political boom and bust cycle once every 10 years, and ad perpetuum, and like a sort of unhinged satellite is destined to sort of spin off into space, never to be seen again. I think that's a notion which, okay, slightly exaggerated, I admit, but that's a notion which we've got to try to negate, and while recognizing the numerous challenges, as I mentioned before, in various key areas of democratic reform. I think what we've got to do is to realize that in terms of international recognition, Georgia has a good standing. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau once said, "You're never a philosopher in your own country, or prophet." And certainly here people would be critical of Georgia's achievements, but I would say that those achievements exist, whether they're in terms of Transparency Index, or in terms of the World Bank's Doing Business Index, or World Economic Forum Global Competitive Indicator, or any of these global indicators. Georgia is advancing relatively well, and I think that needs to be defended and that needs to be supported.
Well, just final question, please, because we are running out of time. Please be short.
Thank you very much. So my question is more about the situation of the human rights in Georgia, because when we are talking about the democratic development, the human rights is also one of the most important indicators. So I forgot I represent the Georgian Young Lawyers Association here. So I want to pay your attention to the situation and human rights situation, especially in the area of the minorities. In Georgia, we have very critical cases, like in case of religious minorities or sexual minorities in Georgia, and so the Georgian government and Georgian population doesn't have a tolerance to these minority groups. So my question is about how would you evaluate the situation in the context of the minorities and the rights of the minorities in Georgia. in Georgia, and how would you advise to improve the situation in this regard? And also, at this moment, the Georgian parliament is also discussing the issue, one of this draft law to make about the religious statements or some critical religious statements which may be insulting for some religious groups. And the Human Rights Committee at this moment in Georgian Parliament approved this amendment to the law. So what's your position about this? And how would you assess the situation, the separation of the church and the government, and the critical opinions in the religious context as well? So, thank you very much.
Who you are addressing this question, please, or to all the panel?
I think Mr. Nodia would be the best one, but I think all of them would be interesting.
That's the issue is there. Is for sure, it's somehow some kind of a mixture of governance problem or government problem, how government should address this issue, and on the other hand, it's a kind of societal problem, which has been there for some time. Somehow it happened that it became a little bit worse in the last years. But I would say that it's a mixture of good news and bad news. And religious minorities, I remember, like years 99, 2000, some new generation of civic activists were not yet civic activists, but we had this real religious violence against the Jehovah's Witnesses and evangelicals and some other mainly Protestant sects, and which went up fully unpunished, so government just watched and did not do anything, although it was kind of very ostentatious right to these people, basically. And the problem was first that the government did not do anything, but secondly that in society I was maybe a little bit more activist than now. We tried to find some people who would protest against this religiously motivated violence. It was perpetrated not by church per se, but by defrocked priests. But even though, apart from a very narrow group of NGO activists, maybe 20 people, nobody wanted to say anything against. It was so unpopular to say anything against religiously motivated violence. Now it really became widely discussed topic, there is at least some societal action trying to counter. And with sexual minorities, okay, 12 years ago, I did not know anybody who was openly homosexual in this country. In fact, people just didn't exist. Now we have homosexual organizations of LGBT rights and people who are saying, okay, yes, I'm different from others, that's fine. So you have this kind of progress. But also you have sometimes more aggressive. Why is it more of aggressiveness? I think there may be some political reasons, because the new government, Georgian Dream government, being a very diverse coalition, includes some people and it used quite widely xenophobic motives in its pre-election campaign. So considers that Saakashvili is bad, not because he is violating human rights so much, but because he is bringing Turks to Georgia, or Nigerians, or Indians. At that time I talked to quite a few people who said I'm voting against him because he's giving Gajara to the Turks. So, and these people decided that, okay, our time has come to attack those minorities. So I don't think that kind of top level of government, including most of all, of course, Mr. Ivanisevic himself, is a xenophobic person or something that government tries to alleviate that, but in a way it also contributed to, maybe unwittingly, maybe not, to this tide of violence. But in general, unfortunately, this is, some people call it dark side of democracy, that when you have a kind of masses having more influence, these masses may be xenophobic sometimes. So it's also true of some other democracies. We talk about Trump phenomenon, maybe it has something to do with that as well. So, yeah, unfortunately, democracy is a very complicated thing.
Thank you. I think.
Too, because I think this is an extremely important question. First thing I would say, and maybe this is an inappropriate thing to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. The most poisonous religious intolerance, if you look at kind of Central Asia, all the way west to the Atlantic Ocean, that has been the most murderous and nastiest, is anti-Semitism. And there's not a lot of that in Georgia. And to Georgians, that may seem like that's nothing. But if you're not Georgian, it's a big deal. You know, it's a big deal. And so I feel like, I don't know, you know, that these problems of religious intolerance is serious. But there is another side to that. And we all need to be, by we all, I mean those of us who are outside, those of us who are foreigners, have to be respectful that there is a tradition of religious tolerance in Georgia, and that's something on which you can build, one hopes. I want to also address the LGBT issue. Unlike Ghia, I grew up in San Francisco in the 1970s. So I did know, we called them gay back then, but I knew gay people from a very young age. I grew up in a household where we were taught not to be prejudiced against people because they were gay. I remember having people I knew dying of AIDS before I would bet almost anyone in this room, with a few exceptions, knew what AIDS was. So these issues are extremely something, you know, that I'm aware of and are very important to me. However, I would also say that this is, and this is a cliche, but I'm going to say it. These are issues with many countries struggle, right? And you know, in my view, when I look at one of the major political parties in my country, I think of this as prima facie bigoted in their approach to LGBT rights, and not just where it plays out legislatively, but what they say and what's okay to say, and whose churches they worship, So it's a cliche to say it's a problem everywhere, but it is a problem everywhere. It is worse in Georgia than in some countries. It is better than Georgia in some countries. You refer to it as religious intolerance and homophobia as problems of democracy. But gay folks don't have a lot of rights in China either, or a lot of Middle Eastern countries that aren't so democratic, right? So this is a problem of humanity, in my view. That's not helpful, though. That's just me ranting. So I'll move away from that and say, how do we solve this problem? The short answer is I don't know. The longer answer is that this is in the West, particularly in the United States, viewed as a problem within democracy, not a problem of democracy. And I don't know if I agree with that or not, but that is the sense in the U.S. And the one thing that strikes me is that, you know, my kids who are teenagers now in New York have had friends almost their entire lives who have two mothers or two fathers. I never knew people like that. I knew people who, after their parents got divorced, one of their parents came out, but they'd already kind of grown up, you know, and that person had a partner of the same gender. That they had already grown up. They're growing up in a very different world. It didn't happen by magic in the United States, and it didn't happen because we're such nice, tolerant people. Anyone who's been following the news from America for the last few months doesn't need to be reminded of that. But it happened because it was a strong civil society, a strong movement, and a very smart one. And the problem here in Georgia is that that movement hasn't had time to grow yet, and it may not have time in this kind of environment. But what that does say to me is that a smart campaign by a smart government, an information campaign, to talk to people, to persuade people, to explain that, you know, to explain issues of equality, to explain that this is not, you know, that a lot of what the LGBT stuff is being pushed by people with very nefarious, the anti-LGBT things with very nefarious intentions for Georgia. So this requires an engagement of the citizenship. It requires a civil society component, and obviously you represent that, so I don't need to tell you that. but it also requires a government to partner, right? And in many places, the government was not a partner in this. It's really, I mean, you know, the former Secretary of State of the United States, who is now running for president, was instrumental, personally, along with the current president, in making LGBT rights something that our foreign policy, with which our foreign policy was concerned. But that's pretty late in the game. I'm not taking away from Obama or Clinton, but that's pretty late in the game. And if Ted Cruz gets elected, and you know, it's going to change, right? So this stuff is really difficult, and it's very important, and requires a lot of engagement from a lot of different places.
Not to be redundant, so I'm just going to add a couple of things. The first thing is that I think that, first of all, thank you for the work that you and your organization do. You guys do great stuff for Georgia and advocacy for human rights. But also say that in many respects, I think law enforcement and governmental bodies in Georgia right now are facing a more complex set of standards, or more complex set of problems to deal with than they have in the past. I think in the past, under the previous government, there was far more ubiquitous security apparatus and governmental apparatus that made its position on these things rather clear. That didn't stop protests from, anti-gay protests from happening. Remember one in Bucket Park, or anti-Halloween type of protests from breaking out periodically, but it was certainly far less of an issue than you saw after the change of power. And I think part of that is because the law enforcement apparatus right now is not prepared to be proactive about these type of things. And so if I'm going to offer a solution, I think a lot of the problem stems from being able to communicate the gravity of the issue, which I think Lincoln has done a very good job of doing, to governmental and law enforcement bodies, something maybe Ghia is and can do, but also providing options for giving them an understanding of what it means and why, and what it means to be proactive to prevent these types of things. And I'll end on one thing. One last note is that the importance of this issue, I think, is very, very powerful, and I think it becomes a security issue as well. In November, I think it was, ISIS released a video in which a Georgian ISIS fighter, Ghia, I believe his name was, who was from Achara. One of the main themes that he and others in this ISIS video discussed was this idea that in their youth or growing up, that Sunni Muslims in Achara were repressed, and that they had joined ISIS to strike back against the Georgian state, in the Georgian majority population that had repressed them. So when that becomes a recruitment and radicalization factor, that certainly is an issue of security, and not just a matter of, are we going to, let these minorities do their thing. It becomes an issue for every Georgian and for every Georgian's well-being.
Well, thank you for your answers. As smart people say, even good things are boring if it's too much, and I don't want to face this. And also, people say that you should use the momentum to give a good applause to the panelists, while there are people that I don't want people to lose that nobody applauds. So, Mr. Ghia, Nodia, Mr. Niels, Scott, Mr. Lincoln, and Michael Petula, please. But before we end, I would like to propose, if you have any final comment, just in a few sentences, please.
I'm sorry, I've talked way too much. But, our colleague, Mr. Scott, I think you were a little too self-deprecating, because you made a very important point that I was a little bit something which we should. You talked about a 10-year path, a 10-year vision, looking back 10 years, seeing the changes over those 10 years. That's not an accomplishment of Saakashvili's government or of the Ivanishvili, the Georgian Dream government. It's an accomplishment of both. It's an accomplishment of Georgian civil society, and it's an accomplishment of the Georgian people. And to think in terms of what are those groups doing, how are those groups moving forward, rather than this government's more democratic than that government, that's also a very useful approach to thinking about Georgia's democratic trajectory.
Thank you very much. To respond to Professor Nodia's first remarks about why we had this panel as the final one, well, it's more theoretical, like talking about democracy. It can last hours, if not the days of discussion. So, giving just general remarks about democratic development of Georgia, maybe I will be very general, and everybody knows this. Georgia has not developed as the democratic state yet. Absolutely right, like we are still on our path towards Western democracies. But I think, it's my personal opinion, that we need to develop our society as a democratic. We had, like long traditions of not to be a democratic state. We were under the Soviet Union for a long time. Before that, we had the Russian Empire, and Georgia, the part, and we, the people of Georgia, are not developed as democratic society. Maybe it needs generations to do it. We have examples of the Western democracies, and we don't have to invent something. We just need to adopt it and give it and give the floor to the practical implementation of democratic development. So I think such kind of forums, such kind of conferences, maybe it's very elite, like we are seeing the people we know, and maybe we communicate and work daily with each other. I think we should give more development to the rural areas in Georgia. We should organize more such kind of gatherings and teach people about the democratic development, how it is important, not only just for the idealistic rule of law or good judiciary, transparent governance, or whatever it is, but for the democratic development. We combine these two issues, economic and democratic development, because they are very much related to each other. So I really hope that in future we will have the opportunity to have a more broader audience, just work with the different groups of society about the economic and democratic issues, to raise the awareness about it, because we need to develop Georgian society as a democratic and open society. We started it in Georgia gained independence in 1991, and we are still developing it more. Yeah, we have good results in open governance, we have good results in fighting corruption. We are leading some of the indexes, but still we need to develop our society as democratic society, because not the politicians should be giving the directions to the public, but the public should be giving directions towards the democratic development of the government as well. Once again, I would like to express my gratitude to you, the audience, who stayed with us, who listened to us. I hope that we had organized quite an interesting panels. Once again, my gratitude to our visiting speakers, to our speakers who accepted our invitation and delayed their daily work and spent these hours with us. And first of all, very important supporter of not only IDFI, but our country, our partner organizations, government of Germany, in particular the Federal Foreign Office of Germany, and our partner, Mr. Zimmerman, is representing University of Bremen, and we had the 2 years cooperation in developing these particular directions as the economic, social, democratic directions. So I really hope that we will have the opportunity to meet again very soon, and once again, good applause to our panelists and all participants of our conference.